I was still wearing the hospital bracelet when I heard him say it. I did it all on my own, he told the room, his voice confident, almost proud, like he'd climbed a mountain barefoot. People clapped. A few even raised their glasses. I sat there in the corner, still healing from surgery, a scarf over my thinning hair, my body aching in ways no one could see. I had asked him just once not to plan the celebration while I was still in recovery. It won't be a big deal, he'd said. Just a few people, but the room was full. Faces I didn't know. People he wanted to impress, and not once did he mention the check. Not once did he say, "She helped me." Not even a vague nod in my direction. I'd written it while lying in that narrow bed. The beep of monitors beside me, nurses walking in and out. He'd called in a panic about a deadline, about something falling through. I didn't hesitate. I asked the nurse for a pen. Transferred $8,000 from the only account I had. And now here he was, toasting his resilience, his determination, his solo journey. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the kind of disbelief that makes you question your own memory. Had I imagined it? Did I dream that moment? That sacrifice? I looked down at my hands, frail but steady. I didn't need applause, but I deserved not to be erased. And in that instant, I knew I would not stay silent this time. I watched him work the room like a politician, shaking hands, laughing too loud, retelling the same story about how he almost gave up, but pushed through. Every line rehearsed, every smile aimed. It was a performance, and he was nailing the part. No one asked who had helped. No one questioned the details, and why would they? He gave them what they wanted, an underdog hero, self-made and spotless. I sat quietly, surrounded by strangers who thought I was just a relative tagging along. One woman asked if I was his aunt. Another assumed I was someone he used to work with. He didn't correct them. He didn't say, "That's my partner," or "She made this possible." He didn't even glance my way. It was as if I had been scrubbed from his origin story entirely. I had stayed up late helping him edit his pitch deck. I had answered calls during chemo sessions. I had believed in the idea when even he didn't. But tonight, in this room, none of that mattered. Only the illusion of solo success did. I shifted in my seat, feeling the edges of the folded check in my purse. I had kept a copy knot for this moment, not out of spite, just to remember, to ground myself in the truth when memory felt slippery. I had written that check because I believed in him, because I loved him. But watching him now, I realized he only loved the parts of me that made him look good. The rest, he edited out. And for the first time, I no longer felt the need to protect his version of the story. The applause faded, replaced by the soft clatter of cutlery and the buzz of small talk. I stayed seated, my hands gently resting on the purse that held the proof. He walked past me once to refill his drink, his eyes barely brushing mine, as if I were just another guest, to be politely acknowledged. It was a surreal thing to be invisible to someone you once nursed through fear and doubt. I remembered how he used to call me from his car, spiraling about failure, his voice shaking. I remembered sitting with him on the floor of our tiny apartment. When he thought everything was falling apart, I remembered holding his hand in silence when he couldn't speak, when all he needed was presence. But none of that had a place in his story now. His version had no room for quiet resilience, for backup plans written on crumpled napkins or checks signed with trembling fingers from a hospital bed. His story needed a clean hero, one who stood alone. I watched him pose for a photo arm, around a woman I'd never met, grinning like he had nothing left to prove. And in that moment, something hardened in me, out of pettiness but preservation. I could no longer carry the weight of being his foundation, while he danced on the rooftop pretending he built it himself. I pulled the check from my dramatically, not with vengeance, but with the calm of someone reclaiming her name from the margins. I looked at it. My name, my handwriting, my sacrifice. And I knew then I wasn't done being part of the story. I was just done letting him write it alone. The next morning, I laid the check on the kitchen table, smoothing out its creases like it was something sacred. I stared at it in the quiet light, letting the weight of it settle over me. But what it had cost me in silence. $8,000? Taken from a savings account I'd spent years building, meant for recovery, for breathing room, after a long stretch of medical bills. I had written it without hesitation, without condition. He'd called me breathless. That afternoon his funding had fallen through. The deadline was hours away, and everything he'd worked for was about to collapse. I didn't ask questions. I didn't ask why he hadn't saved. I didn't even ask when he'd pay me back. I just moved what I had and made it work. Because that's what you do when you love someone, right? You cover the gap. You hold the weight. You carry the dream until they can run again? I didn't think I needed credit. But I also didn't think he'd rewrite the story without me in it. That was the part that stung. Not the money, not the exhaustion, the erasure. I ran, my fingers over the ink, remembering how weak I'd felt when I signed it. The 4 still taped to my arm. He hadn't even stayed that long at the hospital that day. Said he had a meeting, said he'd come back later. He never did. And yet I still convinced myself it was love, that love was enough. But love without recognition is a silence that swells. And mine had been growing for years, until last night finally taught me to hear it. I spent the rest of the day folding laundry and moving through quiet routines. But my mind kept circling that night like a loose thread I couldn't tuck away. I tried to rationalize his words, to imagine some version where he hadn't meant harmware. Maybe he'd just gotten carried away. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe he forgot. But that kind of forgetting only happens when someone was never truly present in your memory to begin with. I remembered the night I wrote that check more vividly than almost anything else. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room, the beeping rhythm of the monitor, the slight sting in my wrist where the IV shifted every time I moved, and then his voice through the phone, panicked, desperate, leaning on me like he always had. I had still been groggy from meds, barely able to sit upright, but something in me pushed through the haze. He needed me, and that had always been enough to make me show up, even if I was the one bleeding. I'd never seen myself as the kind of woman who would ask for praise. I believed in quiet strength, in showing up and staying steady, in being the one others could count on. But that night proved something I hadn't wanted to face. I had trained him to see my sacrifices as guaranteed. Not because he was cruel, but because I had let silence become my language, and now I was the only one left to translate it. Not for him, for myself. So I wouldn't forget again what it took to keep someone else's world from falling apart. That evening, I opened the drawer where I kept everything that felt too heavy to throw away: old appointment cards, get well letters, a photo of us from the early days when everything still felt balanced. In the back, I found the envelope he had sent me months ago with his startup proposal inside. Printed neatly, color-coded tabs. A note that read, "This is it. Finally." I had read it 3 times that day, despite the nausea from treatment and the tightness in my chest. I believed in him. Even now, I didn't regret helping him. What I regretted was the way I disappeared from his narrative the moment he found a stage. And I realized as I sat there holding those pieces of a history we built together, that it wasn't just him who erased MIT, was me, too. I had allowed it, over and over. I had nodded politely when he took credit. I had stepped back when he needed space to lead. I had made myself small so he could shine. But growth shouldn't require disappearance. Love shouldn't mean surrendering your place in the story. I took a deep breath, folded the proposal back into the envelope, and placed the copy of the check beside it. I wasn't planning revenge. I didn't want to embarrass him. What I needed was to stop hiding my part in things, not to demand praise, just to be honest. With others, yes, but most of all with myself, because I'd been generous for too long in a room where generosity had become invisible. And now, it was time to be seen. 2 days later, we ended up at the same gathering, another one of his milestone events. This time at a co-working space with champagne and plastic name tags. I hadn't planned to go, but a mutual friend had insisted. "You should be there," she'd said. "You helped build this too." I stood near the back, unnoticed at first. Watching him tell the same story he always did, how he'd started from scratch, how no one believed in him, how he pulled it all together by sheer willpower. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. The envelope with the check inside resting quietly in my purse. I hadn't brought it to make a scene. I didn't need that. I just needed it near me, like a compass. Something to remind me of the truth while I stood in the middle of his fiction. He hadn't seen me yet, but others had. A few people approached, smiled politely, asked how I knew him. I answered honestly. We started together. That line always landed funny. People blinked, nodded, changed the subject. He walked past me once, stopped mid-step, and smiled like we hadn't just shared years of life. "Didn't know you'd come," he said. Almost hesitant. "Didn't know I was invited," I replied. That shut him up for a second, but only a second. Then he turned back to the crowd, ready to keep the show going. I watched him take a breath, step forward again. That's when I reached into my bag. Not with drama, not with anger, just with a decision, one that had been years in the making. He was mid-sentence when I stepped closer, not interrupting, not speaking, just moving into the space he had filled with half-truths. The group around him parted slightly, curiosity flickering across their faces. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply extended the check, unfolded and steady in my hand, and said, "This is from the day you said no one helped." "You." He froze. Eyes dropped to the paper. A few people leaned in, reading the numbers, the date, the name, on the signature line. Mine, it wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. He didn't say anything at first. His jaw tightened, his hand still half raised in some exaggerated gesture that now hung awkwardly in the air. One of his colleagues, someone I'd never met, broke the silence. "She gave you $8,000. I turned to her calmly from a hospital bed. The day before his launch deadline, she blinked, clearly trying to make sense of the scene. He started to speak, stammering something about timing, about context, about how hard things were back then, but it didn't matter. The check had already said what needed to be said. I wasn't there to embarrass him. I was there to reappear, to erase myself. I tucked the check back into my bag without a word and looked him in the eye. Not with anger but with clarity. "Just remember," I said quietly, "some people carry your success while they're too sick to stand. Don't forget them just because the room claps louder for you now." And then I stepped back, letting the weight of the truth settle where it belonged. I didn't wait for a reaction. I didn't need one. The power wasn't in his apology, it was in my return to visibility. I walked toward the edge of the room, not storming out, just stepping out of the orbit I had once revolved around. As I moved, I heard the murmur begin behind me, voices lowered, questions whispered, eyes shifting from him to me and back again. He had spent so long curating an image of independence that the simple truth, one piece of paper, one line of ink, had cracked it open. That was never my goal. I hadn't come to destroy him. I came to remind myself that I existed outside his version of events, outside the silence I had mistaken for strength. I exited through the side door and sat on a bench nearby, the cool evening air washing over my skin like a reset. I didn't cry, I didn't replay what had just happened, I just breathed. For the first time in a long while, my breath felt mine. Not borrowed, not held. Mine. People came and went from the building behind me. None of them looked for me. But that was okay. I wasn't hiding anymore. I had shown up, shown truth, and reclaimed a piece of my story that had almost vanished. And he would have to carry the weight of that check now. Not because I asked him to, but because truth once seen doesn't go back to sleep. And maybe the applause would sound different next time. Maybe not. Either way, I had finally heard my own silence and answered it. 2 days passed before I heard from him again. A text, short and uncertain. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, unsure what answer he actually expected. Did he want to explain? Apologize? Rewrite the moment yet again, only with a softer spin this time? I didn't reply right away. I let the question sit. I made coffee, folded a blanket, watched the way the morning light stretched across the floor like it was claiming space, quietly, firmly. Eventually I wrote back, "We can talk, but I won't be edited this time." He didn't respond right away, and honestly, I was okay with that. I'd said what I needed. That afternoon we met at a small cafe halfway between our apartments. He looked tired, or maybe just stripped of the performance I had grown used to. "I didn't think it would matter," he said after the first sip of coffee. "I didn't think you wanted credit." I nodded, slowly. "I didn't want credit," I said. "I wanted to not be erased." He looked down. "It wasn't fair," he admitted, "and it wasn't true. You were there for everything." There it was, the first full sentence of truth I'd heard from him in a long time. I didn't reach for his hand. I didn't rush to comfort him. I just let it land. That was the difference now? I wasn't there to soothe the discomfort of accountability. I was there to name it, to sit in it, to let him feel the shape of what had been missing all along. Recognition that didn't come with a spotlight, but with silence finally broken. He asked if I had kept the check, as if unsure whether the truth he'd been forced to face still existed outside that moment. "I have a copy," I said. "The original's long gone. It was cashed the same day you gave your first interview." He smiled awkwardly like the timeline had never occurred to him. "I guess I didn't connect it back then," he muttered. I nodded. "That's the thing about support," I said. "It's invisible when it's working. You only feel it when it's gone." He didn't argue. Maybe he couldn't. The silence between us wasn't tense, it was honest. He asked if I'd forgive him, but I told him I didn't think forgiveness was the word I needed. "What I need," I said slowly, "is space. Space to exist outside of you. Space to rebuild the version of me that didn't rely on being the foundation for someone else's glory." He looked away, swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to make you feel erased." "I know," I replied. "But you did, and now I'm unerasing myself." We sat for a while longer, speaking in the way people do when the storm has passed, but the air is still thick with what it carried. I didn't hate him. That surprised me. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted peace, and maybe the kind of future where I didn't have to keep proving that I mattered. Not through money, not through sacrifice, just by being without needing to be useful to earn a place at someone else's table before we left. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small folder. "These are the investor reports," he said. I thought maybe you'd want to see what became of it." I hesitated for a second before accepting it. Not because I was curious about the numbers, but because I wanted to see if he meant it. If offering me the folder was a gesture of transparency or just another layer of performance. The pages inside were neat, color-coded, almost too polished. But tucked at the end was something else, a handwritten note. Short, unedited, vulnerable. "You were right. I didn't do it alone. I just didn't know how to share the stage with someone who never needed it. I'm sorry, it wasn't flowery, it wasn't eloquent, but it was real and it was enough." I closed the folder and looked at him not with affection, but with a quiet understanding that some bridges don't burn, they just narrow to footpaths where only truth can cross. "Take care of your story," I told him, "but make sure it holds everyone who carried you." He nodded, eyes low, and we stood up at the same time. No hug, no promises, just a mutual release. As I walked away, the folder under my arm, I felt something shift, not in him, but in me. I had taken up space. I had corrected the record, and now I no longer needed the room to clap. I just needed to know that I had finally spoken and that the silence once mine to hold now belonged to someone else. A week later, I found myself back at the hospital not as a patient, but for a routine checkup. The halls felt smaller somehow, less intimidating than they used to. I walked past the room where I'd written that check, where the machines had beeped steadily and the nurses had whispered kindly around my pain. I paused outside the door, remembering how scared I had been that day, not just of the diagnosis, but of losing pieces of myself while trying to hold someone else together. That version of me had believed that love required erasure, that if I gave enough, forgave enough, stayed quiet enough, I would be loved the way I loved back. But now, standing there in the light of my own survival, I felt something different. Not pride, exactly, but wholeness. I had faced invisibility and walked out with proof that I existed. Not just to him, but to myself. After the appointment, I sat in the hospital cafe with a cup of tea and opened the folder he had given me. Not for validation, just for closure. I looked at the numbers, the charts, the note again. But what stayed with me most wasn't the apology, it was the fact that I no longer needed it to feel seen. That check had once been a symbol of my love, but now it was a line I drew, a boundary, a moment where I said, I was here, I mattered, and that truth, whispered quietly to myself, was louder than any speech he'd ever given. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the lights low and the windows open, letting in the kind of breeze that carries memory and peace in equal measure. I lit a candle not out of ritual, but out of recognition, a soft reminder that I was still here, still whole, still choosing myself after years of pouring into others. I pulled out the copy of the check one last time. The ink had faded slightly at the corners, but the numbers were still clear. I smiled, not because of what it cost me, but because of what it represented now. It was no longer a receipt of sacrifice. It was a signature of strength. I placed it in a small box, alongside other quiet mementos of the woman I used to be. A pair of earrings I wore to every hospital visit. A photo from the day I moved out of our shared apartment. A list of affirmations I never had the courage to say aloud. Until now, I wasn't looking for closure anymore. I had passed that stage. What I had found instead was clarity, the kind that doesn't need confrontation, only self-respect. He would go on telling stories. Some might include me, most probably wouldn't, and that was no longer mine to fix. What mattered was that I knew the full version, and I had finally learned to carry it without asking anyone else to hold it for me, not even him. That kind of freedom doesn't come in applause. It comes in the silence that no longer hurts. Before going to bed, I stood by the mirror and looked at myself longer than usual. Not to check my reflection, but to recognize the woman looking back, the one who gave without asking, who endured without applause, who once thought her value depended on being useful, invisible, convenient. She wasn't bitter now, just done, disappearing. I thought about all the times I'd been written out of stories I helped build. Times I stood behind the curtain while someone else took the bow, and I realized maybe I was never meant to be part of their version. Maybe I was always meant to write my own. The check had done its job, not by humiliating him, not by proving a point to anyone in the room, but by reminding me that I was never just supporting cast. I was a chapter, a turning point, a reason the story moved forward at all. I blew out the candle and sat quietly for a moment in the dark, no longer afraid of the quiet. It didn't swallow me. Anymore, it held me. It made room for me. That night, I didn't fall asleep replaying what I could have said. I slept knowing that I had said enough, that I had shown up, that I had left no part of myself behind. Not for him, not for them, just for me. Have you ever been left out of someone's story until you finally decided to tell your own?